Computer. Okay, so welcome. This is a meeting that's being video recorded to make available on YouTube to others who can't join us this morning. I know there are probably going to be quite a few of those. Honor our speaker as well as those who are able to join us on time. We're starting this meeting promptly as announced previously. We'll add others as they arrive. This is a meeting of the Puget Sound Passport Rotary Club, joined by our friends from Kiwanis, Lions, Theroptimist, and other local organizations who share our dedication to community service. And Also, we're also collaborating with our friends from the Seattle King County League of Women Voters. So we welcome their members as well. I've got several other people that are asking to come in right now, so I'll just make sure that they get in. Bill McCulley is coming in, Kim Albert. So this program originally was intended for March 13th. Puget Sound Passport Rotary is now a digital Rotary Club, which allows us to schedule speakers and topics virtually whenever we wish. So let's just get right to it. Our speaker this morning is Washington State's 18th Attorney General, Bob Ferguson. As the state's chief legal officer, I'm sorry, I've got other people coming in. The state's chief legal officer, Bob is committed to protecting the people of Washington against powerful interests that don't play by the rules. Bob Ferguson is a fourth generation Washingtonian, a graduate of the University of Washington and later of New York University Law School. Bob began his legal career in Spokane. He clerked for two federal judges before returning to Seattle to join Preston Gates and Ellis, now K&L Gates. There, his civil litigation practice included work on behalf of taxpayers, corporations, and small businesses. In 2003, Bob was elected to the first of three terms on the King County Council, where he served until being elected Washington State Attorney General in 2013. Now, here's something I did not know about him. Bob is an internationally rated chess master and twice won the Washington State Chess Championship. His topic this morning is the decline of local media, a public policy issue that's of critical importance to all of us. He promised to give you ample time for questions when he's finished. So with that, please mute your microphones until he's done and help me welcome to our Passport Club microphone, Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson.
Hey, David, thanks so much, and thanks for that introduction. It's great to see you again. Thanks for the warm reception, everybody. I've known David a long time, actually, and so it's great to see you again, David, and thanks all of you for being on this morning. I'd asked Dave if I could talk about the state of international chess for my topic, and he said, no, we can't do that. We need something a little more local. So I'll save that for another group. But no, this is actually a topic that it's one of those things that when I first ran for Attorney General back in 2012, if you'd ever told me a decade later I'd be kind of engaged on issue of what's happening, what we see currently with newspapers in our state and around the country, the significant attrition of that, the lack of what I would consider real progress on addressing that, I would have thought that's never something as Attorney General I'd be involved in as Attorney General. That wasn't on my radar a decade ago, but it certainly is now. And so really appreciate the chance to chat a little bit about it. I'll say at the outset, I'm a bit of a generalist on this issue, right? There are certainly folks who are experts on this issue, have thought a lot longer about than I have. But as someone who is the Attorney General, who, really depends on a thriving, independent, local news media for the work that we do and for the preservation of our democracy that we all care about, I'm pretty interested in the subject. And David had asked me maybe to focus more on solutions to what we see. I know there's been reports that the League and others have put out, so that's what I'm going to try to do. If I can just say at the outset, David, that hey, any meeting that combines two wonderful organizations like the Rotary and the League of Women Voters is a meeting I want to be a part of. I think I've been to over 200 different Rotary Club meetings around the state, which I think there are about 200. So at some point I decided I'd hit them all, and it really has been great to get to every corner of the state and talk to folks all around the state about what's on their mind. And of course, Legal Women Voters, I know well and just so deeply appreciate all that you do for our state. So thanks for having me. Real brief, I'm going to give you a 40-second overview of the AG's office. I'm happy to take at the end of this discussion if folks have more general questions about what's going on in the state. And if David, if there's time, I'm happy to do that. But I would just like to tell people kind of who we are and what we do. We're the largest law firm in the state of Washington. We have 13 offices around the state of Washington. I was just in Spokane the other day. We have an office there, for example. We think of our work in two buckets. And it's kind of relevant to some of our conversation coming up. The first bucket is we're the law firm for the state of Washington, which means every state board, commission, agency, the legislature, the governor, we're their lawyers. We give them legal advice. They decide what they want to do. Okay. And that's important. Just like you have lawyers who advise you on all sorts of things in your life, personal affairs, your business, your lawyer, a good lawyer will give you advice, give you options. You decide what you want to do. That's your decision. And your lawyer can't speak about that publicly, right? That's actually an oath that we take. We cannot speak about our legal advice. The clients make the decisions. The other part of our work, which is smaller in terms of people, but still significant, is what we call affirmative litigation, work we do directly on behalf of the people. So anytime you see my office filing a consumer protection lawsuit, maybe a lawsuit at the federal level, we were just in court in Spokane and a lawsuit against the Biden administration, though antitrust cases, some criminal work we do, that work is all work that we bring on behalf of the people. There's not a state agency that's driving that. It's our affirmative work we do on behalf of all of you. And so those are my decisions. Okay, if I'm filing a lawsuit against a corporation, I don't call the governor and ask permission. That's something that I choose on behalf of the people. And I can speak more freely about that because there's not a state client that I have certain limitations around, if that makes sense. So those are sort of the two buckets of the work we do. Within that second bucket, and this will get to our conversation today, while I'm not a legislator, I can propose legislation. I'll be talking about a specific piece of legislation shortly. I can propose legislation to the state legislature just like the governor can, for example. It's referred to as Attorney General request legislation. We draft it up, but we have to get sponsors in the House, sponsors in the Senate. It's got to be passed by the House, passed by the Senate, just like any other bill. But I do have the ability to propose legislation, and one of the solutions that hopefully it's a solution that we'll be talking about here this morning is a bill that I'm proposing with some key legislators, Mark Mullet, Jerry Plett, and others to help address the issue that we're going to talk about here today. So with that brief background, there's a lot of quotes that that one can speak to or can cite for the importance of independent news organizations and newspapers. One that I've always liked is Thomas Jefferson, in which he said, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." That's how important it was to Thomas Jefferson. And candidly, I really believe that. And in my work, just to give you some examples, having a thriving newspaper news industry is critically important for the work that we do. Number one, to help communicate out to the people the work that we do. But honestly, what's perhaps even more important is in that affirmative work we do on behalf of the people, right, where we bring cases, consumer protection cases, civil rights cases, the ideas for those cases generally come from two sources. One, a Washingtonian writes to us with a complaint. The other is we read about it in the newspaper, okay? And I could give you dozens of examples of cases that we brought, many of which you'd be very familiar with, that we brought in which we learned about it from a newspaper. One of our large consumer protection cases was one that I was traveling and read a small Arizona newspaper was covering a story about Motel 6 and how Motel 6 in Arizona was providing to law enforcement officials the identities of all of their guests without any warrant, without any suspicion of anybody. These agents would come in, immigration officials, and ask for a list of any names of people staying at the Motel 6 with a Latino name. They're looking for folks who might not be documented in this country. And Motel 6, without a warrant, without anything, just turned over those guest lists in total violation of their guest privacy. So if you stayed in Motel 6 there, your names were turned over. Well, I was suspicious that might have been going on in Washington State. So we did an investigation in Motel 6, and guess what? They're doing the same thing. If you stayed in Motel 6 in Washington State during these years, it's very likely your name was turned over to law enforcement officials with Motel 6 not telling you that's what they were doing, and in contrast to their assurance on their website that they protected your personal information. Well, that was a huge case. Motel 6 had to pay millions of dollars, and we stopped that practice. But it was literally because I read a newspaper article in an Arizona newspaper and thought to myself, I wonder if that's going on in Washington State. Again, I give you many more examples, but it's an example of the work that local newspapers do, right, on the ground to expose government corruption, government officials not doing a good job, or bad actors in public, or then we can do something about it. So with that sort of background in mind, and now to focus on what I think David asked me to focus on a bit is, well, hey, where are there some solutions on what we can do? And what I'm going to do, if it's okay, maybe, David, is try to give a couple of examples at different levels. One that Congress is working on, one that the state legislature is working on, and one even that a foreign country is working on, okay? And again, I'm sort of a generalist here, so these are things that I see. We're focused on one in particular, but I'm going to put a couple ideas out there and really hopefully give you an opportunity to dive down on it in a deeper way with your own research as well. If you're going to start somewhere in Washington State, a good place to start if you want to do your own research is with the Seattle Times. There's a guy named Briar Dudley who's on the editorial board. He writes about this issue that we're talking about on a regular basis, and writes very thoughtfully about that, and is often writing about what's going on around the world and around the country and in Washington State around this issue. And I just would encourage you, as one example, if you're looking to do more research on it, Briar is a really good resource for all of that. So let me start maybe with the sort of local in Washington State. So I think many of you know the numbers, in Washington State, for example, the number of reporters covering the state capitol has dwindled dramatically in recent years. And I think they're down to about maybe 5 full-time reporters, something like that. I think they had 16 as recently as 2020 or thereabouts, and many, many more in the years before that. We've lost about 20% of our newspapers in Washington State. That's pretty typical for other jurisdictions and states around the country as well. So in Washington, the state legislature, in order trying to address this dwindling of newspapers, this loss of newspaper reporters, those folks covering, hey, when I was on the King County Council, we had 2 reporters cover the King County Council seemingly full time. It wasn't that long ago, and it's very different today. So the state legislature, a number of years ago, took an action to try to preserve and assist newspapers. And so what they did was they took the business and occupation tax, the B&O tax, and they provided an exception for local newspapers. And this was something they adopted back around 2010 or so. It's been about a decade or so that they first provide this specific tax relief for newspapers. And it's a huge help for newspapers. For anyone who's on this call could speak to it better who works for a newspaper, but this is a huge assistance for newspapers and can often be, as we've heard in public testimony, the difference between being able to make payroll and not. It's a small amount of money in the scheme of things for the state, a couple $1 million a year, but it's a lot for these newspapers that are serving their communities. Well, that legislation is great, but it is set to expire. That exemption is set to expire this year, unless the state legislature acts to continue that in some way. So there's a Senate bill, 5199, I believe it is. It's one that I've requested to the state legislature, back to that point I made earlier. And the prime sponsors of it are State Senator Mark Mullet and State Representative Jerry Paulette, are the 2 legislators who are the ones who are helping to get this thing passed. And the intent of this exception, of course, originally was to really cushion the blow for newspapers on the loss of revenue, advertising, et cetera. And I won't go into too much detail about the exception itself, but it's been a huge help for newspapers. The proposal that I have working with Jerry and Mark, with Senator Mullet and Representative Paulette, is to continue that exception, right? To essentially codify that so it's not going to expire. This is a tax break that would be for sort of newspapers specifically. One important thing we've added to it, though, that I want to emphasize is that, there's a lot going on with this. There's amendments, as you can imagine. It's a pretty fluid situation right now as we near the end of the legislature, but we've also included online publications that previously were print publication, right? So an example would be the Seattle PI, right? The Northwest Asian Weekly, for example. Those were print newspapers. Now they've gone online. There'd be assistance for them as well. And to give you a quick status on where things are at, although it's worth knowing, there's often when these things come up, there's a legislative auditor who does an analysis of these things, and that auditor recommended renewal of the levy and of the tax relief, saying, I think the quote is, I'm going to read it: if the legislature is interested in helping the news industry more broadly, it should consider additional approaches. So this is one approach of which there would be others as well. So right now the bill is still very much alive. We had public hearings in which individuals from newspapers like the Columbian and the Tacoma News Tribune and others around the state spoke up in support of it. And you know, I've got to be a little careful. I'm not able to sort of tell people to go call their legislators, so I can give you information about the bill. But it's one that we believe has a path forward, and one that we think, and what we've heard from folks in the newspaper industry, could make a huge difference. I'm going to move on from that, David, quickly. There's kind of more about that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the federal side. So a bill that I'm familiar with, but I'm not directly involved in, obviously, but helpfully, some key Washington state members of Congress are very involved. Most notably, I believe Maria Cantwell, I think, is really sort of spearheading this on the federal side. But it's got bipartisan support, I want to be clear, than the Washington state delegation. So there's a federal initiative. Unfortunately, it's stalled in the last Congress. The name of it is, I believe it's called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. I'm just double checking my notes. The Local Journalism Sustainability Act. This is one that Breyer and others have written about extensively. So just to give you a sense of what it does multiple things, but it allows a local media employer a payroll credit for wages paid to local news journalists, as an example. It allows up to $5,000 in tax credits to local businesses that buy ads. So it provides a number of specific items that help newspapers, encourages people to subscribe to newspapers, provides tax credit, tax breaks for those types of activities, which would be a huge help. It was supposed to be part of the Build Back Better Act, if I recall correctly, but ended up not staying in that legislation, unfortunately. My understanding is Senator Cantwell and others are going to try and bring it back again. Again, really important at the federal level, what's going on there. We're fortunate to have leaders here in Washington state who support that. As Attorney General, why obviously I'm not in Congress, one thing that AGs like myself sometimes do is we write letters to members of Congress if there's a bill in Congress that we kind of is relevant to us, and we encourage them to take a certain action. So on that federal legislation, I drafted up a letter and sent around to all of my colleagues around the country to see if they wanted to join on in support of that legislation. In the end, there were 15 AGs, 15 of the 50 who signed on to it. Candidly, I wish there'd been more, but we encourage those AGs to support it. And for the reasons I mentioned earlier, right? I think you can draw a direct line from the preservation of our democracy and having independent news that is accurate and people can trust. So we have an agreed upon set of facts about what's going on in our country, and to have accountability for politicians like me and with others around our state. Moving briefly now, and I'll be even shorter on the others. Other states are taking action as well. California in particular, they have legislation that allows for grants for journalists coming out of journalism school to work with local news papers around their state. I think it's a very large number that they can fund. I want to say it's about 100. I hope I've got that right. But this is a sort of a grant program that the legislature is putting into effect in California. And in Washington, Karen Kaiser, a state senator in our state, has a version of that in Washington she's trying to get adopted through the state legislature this year as well. So it's an example where California is taking the lead on some issues that, hey, we can learn from and try and do our own thing as well. So states like California are taking their own actions, and I would love to see that happen here in Washington state to help get more news reporters embedded with newspapers across the state. And then lastly, David, and then I'll probably wrap up because in the interest of time, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. Other countries have similar challenges that we have. We're not alone in this. And Australia, I'm quite sure it's Australia, they've taken action that has been quite interesting. That what they have focused on is social media giants who essentially take the hard work of newspaper reporters, right, put on their platform surrounded with advertising, but the newspaper reporters, the newspapers who are the ones who originated that work, aren't getting anything for that work, right? And that's a huge challenge. That could be its own topic of a long conversation that we might have. And so Australia adopted a law that requires those social media platforms to negotiate with the publishers around a fair compensation. And I think the way it works is that they don't get an agreement there. There's like a binding arbitration process that follows, right? And so that's a model that I think is one that is interesting, and one that that folks could be looking at here in Washington State or across the United States as well. So those are a handful of different ideas that I've been reading about that I find interesting. And maybe just to wrap this part up, David, before we open up to any questions, is I so appreciate the interest in this subject from all of you. It's to me, it really is pretty fundamental to where we're going as a society, is the preservation of local news. And I try not to be one who overstates challenges, or crises. I try to be careful with my words, but I really believe it's an existential threat to who we are as a people. That if this continues with the demise of newspapers, if that continues, I guess I don't really want, kind of like Thomas Jefferson, I don't want to think about what our society looks like without that. It's that critical role, I think, for our society. And I just believe that, well, while I would, a lot of people think, well, Ferguson, why are you working on that? You're the Attorney General. That's not really in your lane, so to speak. Well, I disagree with that. I think the preservation of our democracy is in every elected official's lane, right? It's in every citizen's lane. It's in every Washingtonian's lane, that we all have to do whatever we can to talk about this issue, to find ideas, to encourage our legislators to act, to our members of Congress to act, because we need to stop this slide while we can. And these are a few ideas that I've been reading about and thinking about, and encourage you, as I know you all are, to do your own thinking about that as well. So, David, I'm going to stop there and open up to any questions that folks might have. Thanks again so much for having me.
Sure. Thanks to Bob. If you have a question now for the Attorney General, just click on the Reactions tab in the lower right corner of your screen, and then click on Raise Your Hand. We'll do our best to call on you in the order, because this is a collaboration with the League of Women Voters. Our first question was scheduled to come from Heather Kelly. I don't know if Heather is on with us under another name, but our first question was to be from the League of Women Voters. Is there a League member who has a question of Bob Ferguson? Okay, then let's just go ahead and on to others. Sayla Sweet has a question.
Great.
Yes, thank you. I'm a reader of South Seattle Emerald, which is an online newspaper, and it's new. So are they going to be eligible for an exemption? Because the way that you stated it, it was just former print newspapers.
Yeah,
but I think it's important to include other perspectives.
Oh, so first, I agree with you 100% that the range of perspectives is extremely important. So as an outset, number two, there have been a wide range of amendments to this process. I think when the bill first started, it included those types of publications. As it's been amended going forward, I believe now that, and again, I should just really emphasize, one thing I've learned, although not being a legislator, is the legislative process, things are very, very fluid. Things change. Bills where they start and where they end can be very, very different. But there have been, I think the current version is where it only includes online publications if they at some point had been a print publication in the past. We had advocated earlier in the process to include a broader range, to your question, but that's where the amendments have been at this point in the process. But again, things could change back as well. So I just really want to emphasize that. So if you have thoughts about that, I've got to be careful about encouraging people. There's limitations about using state resources to encourage legislation. So, but if you have thoughts about that, all of you are obviously aware of being able to communicate with your legislators about that. But that, I believe, is where the current version of the legislation is.
Thank you.
Shannon has a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for everything that you do for our nation. We really appreciate it. I've been following, longest story, I've been following and I've been admiring. So
Thank you.
I have one question. So if we find I think I have a case that it has one of those adaptations that you were talking about. I find a case that was picked up in California, but I guess we do not have it maybe in Washington. So I'm working. Sorry, I just heard you recommended don't use a state. There's a limitation using the state resources, but unfortunately, I end up being in a cycle that's I am using the state resources, but in a proper way, as much as I can to bring this to you or to your office. Is there any how do you say expedited way, because I think it will be very instrumental in preserving the democracy of our nation, and also because of the backlog you guys have, it keep hitting a statute of limitation. And so I think if you could think about, or if you could suggest a way that can for us to help you more, I would appreciate it for you to share that with me.
And so, Shen, just so I'm clear, so you have an issue you'd like my office to look at? You sort of, the first part, maybe I didn't quite hear very clearly, but is there something you're asking my office to take a look at?
Yes. It's been already done in California. I cannot go too much into it, but the big story, how do you say? The big picture is that a state of California has already started it. It hit a statute of limitation there. So that's why it was not pursued. But now I got into this case and I brought it to one of the judges and he recommended, well, he could not give me any, sorry, no recommendation. I just think that it's better for you to just look at it. Since you're looking at newspapers, it will be, you just talked about adaptation from other countries, other places. So I think it falls into that category. So I think if you have time, it will be better. But I'm trying to go with the steps that's put in for people like me to bring it to your office. But it's very time consuming and it keep hitting a statute of limitation. I think if there is a expedited way or more direct way for you to read it and pick it up if possible, that would be best for the community and preservation of the democracy. But again, I just want to bring it to you since
I'm going to remind everybody that we have to keep our questions brief so that more people get an opportunity to ask the question. So Bob?
Shannon, so Shannon, maybe so without knowing the details of your situation, what I can do, if it's okay with you, is I can just give you the email address of my executive assistant. So she just handles, if you're writing to Judy, you're writing to me, I'm going to see it. And so I'll just give you her email. And if you want to write to her, that might be the best way to do this. And so the email is Judy, Judy, then period, then Gall, her last name is Gall, G like go, AUL. So Judy, period, GAUL at atg.wa.gov. I'll just read back one more time, Shannon. So it's Judy, Judy, period, Gall, GAUL at atg.wa.gov. And if you just write to Judy with whatever the concern is, then we can get that to the right person on the team who can respond to your concern. So really appreciate that, and just really feel free to write to her, and I will see that. Thanks, Shannon.
Bill Franklin from Seattle Downtown Rotary. Bill.
Great.
You're muted, Bill. Still muted. Okay. While we wait for Bill to unmute, Joanne Lisowski.
Great.
I just got myself unmuted. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. I am a former faculty member at Pacific Lutheran University, and I'm very much interested in this issue. I taught journalism for 25 years. I also want to, I'm not sure if you brought this up earlier, but I am a member of the League of Women Voters. And David, I'm sorry I didn't get my hand up fast enough when you asked for that. I couldn't find it. But I am a member of the committee that produced the study on the decline of local news and its impact on democracy. And I posted the study in the chat. It's in the process now of being evaluated by the state league, and you may soon see a policy come from the League of Women Voters in Washington State to support local news. That's what we hope, but I can't say that that's happened yet. And we appreciate that you actually were quoted in that study as well. What I want to ask about has to do with media literacy. It's something that I've been really involved in my whole teaching career. And I think it's really important that people understand what journalism does.
Okay, let's be sure to keep our questions brief now so that more people can ask questions.
I'm sorry, David.
Go ahead.
And I think it's important. I know that there's a bill in the state legislature right now to add more support to the law that was passed several years ago. But talk to me a little bit about the value, what you think the value of media literacy might be in this democracy.
Yeah, I think thanks for that. And again, thanks for the work from the league and the report. I guess what I'd say of, in general, I guess this is a big topic, but I guess what I'd say briefly is that the issue of, I think, Americans, Washingtonians, we don't have civics classes in the same way we used to. So whether it's understanding of government, the role of newspapers, these core institutions, not only do I think we're not sort of teaching that enough, right, in our classrooms, for example, but I think that's been a challenge for many years. But I think what maybe I would add to your question is that that's bad enough. But simultaneously, what's going on is, you're just being honest, right, that there are politicians out there around our country who are undermining those institutions in the way that they speak about them, right? And I think that's a double whammy that is, I don't know if the word unique is correct, but at least as far as my time in my lifetime feels unique, right? To have that sort of double whammy, and the undermining of those institutions is a vital concern. One thing I've always believed, like, in a relationship, right? If David and I have friendship and I say something to David, right, that is cruel, that is mean, that is something, I can't ever take that back, right? Maybe he'll forgive me maybe at some point, right? But it's always out there between me and him, right? It's always there. When politicians who Americans follow and trust and believe in say certain things about our institutions, whether it's our judiciary or the media, that does real damage. That doesn't just go away when that politician goes away. I really believe that. And when a significant number of Americans don't believe the 2020 election was fairly conducted, for example, or don't believe the press when they cover certain things, that combined with, to your point, sort of the lack of education on these issues, where folks can sort of discern for themselves what's accurate and what's not, I think is a double whammy that is really troubling right now.
Okay, I see Bill Franklin has unmuted. Bill?
Great.
The last time we spoke, Mr. Ferguson was with all the former attorneys general, including Mr. Gordon, and I did ask you if your chess informs how you act as attorney general, and you said yes, it definitely does, and I think I can see evidence of that. I was interested in hearing you, as I understood it, talk about somewhat of a kind of a partnership between social media and newspapers, and I hadn't thought about that, but I think that would be a very good thing, because social media I don't think is always constructive, but it's not going away. And just to let you know, my time, I spend a couple of hours every morning reading half dozen newspapers, a couple from other countries. All newspapers do have a bias, so I deliberately choose ones that have both sides, and so I will lament if I lose the opportunity to do that. So I really support what you're doing.
Absolutely. Well, one thing thanks for that, by the way. And one thing I'll add is, I think you used the word sort of partnership of sort of newspapers with social media. I think, to to be candid about it, I'm not sure social media folks view that as a partnership. In other words, in order to make that work, they're being sort of dragged kicking and screaming to the table to make this work with local news publications. Okay, like that is, it's, in other words, it's incumbent upon elected officials to really force that issue and require these social media giants to fairly compensate local news organizations, for example, or reporters for the work that they do, that the social media giants are able to capitalize on and get their own revenue from. So just want to be sort of clear about that, that I think the example I mentioned was in Australia, right? And that is one that, again, I'm not an expert, there are others who are, sort of my understanding is there's got to be a negotiation between the parties. And if it doesn't work out, then there's essentially a binding arbitration that requires the compensation, right? And so I don't know. I know that, for example, I mentioned Briar Dudley's name earlier. I know he wrote an article recently about this, in which I think he tried to get a comment from Google and others about this type of proposal and didn't get a response from them on it. And so it's going to require elected officials to really force that to happen. And, you know, just being real honest, sometimes elected officials don't want to take those big corporations on, you know, that they see a downside for them politically. And I think that's unfortunate. And but your point's well taken. I think that is the future. I think that's what's needed to really long-term address this issue. I think that type of, whether it's a partnership, which would be the ideal world, or whether elected officials sort of force them to the table. I do think long-term, I think there's some short-term measures we can take now that we're talking about with the B&O tax and other things. But I think long-term, I do think that is what needs to happen.
So I see that Scott Wands, president of Lake Forest Park Rotary, has a question. Scott?
Awesome.
Yeah, do you see any way that we can sort of stop what I would refer to as like the economic vultures that come in, they buy up a newspaper, sell off all the assets, pocket a bunch of money, and then they leave? How can we stop that?
Yeah, you know, I actually had in my talking points that bullet to talk about, but I realized I was going on a little too long. So I appreciate you reading my mind and asking about it, because that is under one of the challenges that we're seeing, right, Scott, is exactly what you're raising. And so just so folks who I think are aware, but what he's referring to is you've got these sort of national corporations that come in and buy up these papers for their own economic purposes, but they don't put resources into it, right? And so essentially those publications essentially dry up and become a shell of themselves. You know, from my standpoint, I think the key is, and again, I'm not an expert, I want to be clear about that on some of these issues, but what I think some states like California and Washington, what we're trying to do is to bolster the industry so they don't feel like they have to sell to those entities in the first place, right? Where it's not a fire sale. Hey, we can't make it anymore as a business, so they have little choice but to go that route. And so that's why I think action's required now, you know, yesterday, now, by our state legislature, by other legislatures, by the federal government to help out this industry, so they're not in a position where they have to make that sale, right? They don't want to do that, right? They understand what's happening. And if we can bolster the industry now by taking what I think are relatively common sense steps, then hopefully it avoids that in the first instance, if that makes sense. But your point is extremely well taken. You know, David asked me to focus a bit more on the solution side of it, so I didn't mention that specifically, but it's a huge challenge that we have and that we're seeing all across the country and here in Washington State is exactly what you're outlining.
Bob, Beverly Jacobson of Duval Rotary says she does not have audio, but she asks, what is the one best action that we can do as an individual to move the positive issue forward?
It's a great question. That's from Beverly, you said, is that right?
Beverly Jacobson.
Thanks, Beverly. The one issue, you know, Beverly, sometimes like when I'm speaking, I get a question that says, hey, Bob, what's the one thing? And I always give an answer, of course, but without fail, about 15 minutes after the meeting ends, I always say to myself, man, why didn't I say this other thing? So with that caveat, what's the one thing that sort of a Washingtonian could do? I guess what I would say, it's hard to know, but I guess what I would say, because there's specific areas, I've talked about some of them, that our state legislature can do and our federal representatives can do to help the industry. I'm a big believer in communication with your elected officials on issues you care about. And you know, for what it's worth, I believe that those communications make a difference. Okay. When I talk to legislators about different bills, I often hear them say, hey, I've gotten a lot of email on that. I'm getting a lot of email traffic on that. And so I would encourage that direct communication. And if you have the time and you're able to testify, for example, when these bills have hearings, I think that's critically important as well. And if I could just add to that, I would say writing something personal about why it matters to you is so much better than a form email. Not suggesting you would write a form email, but sometimes I get a bunch of form emails. I just know someone's just copied and pasted. Compared to a handwritten note, if I get a handwritten note from a Washingtonian in my office, I write a note back to that person every time. Because handwritten notes are so infrequent that if someone's going to take the time to handwrite a note to me, I write back to them. I've written thousands of letters that way. So if it can be handwritten, even better. And pick key legislators that you think, whether they're your representatives or others who are key to a particular bill. But that communication, I think, is especially important. And to make it personal, why it matters to you as an individual, as a Washingtonian, I think is the most powerful.
So we probably have time for one more question.
All right.
Does anybody else have a question of the Attorney General? Okay, Shannon.
Just a short one. How can we get involved if we would like to help?
Oh my gosh, to get involved, I mean, there's lots of ways, and I suspect that this group has a lot of ideas. But I mean, it's you know, if you're not already involved with the League of Women Voters, for example, right? Hey, that report that's coming out, that's a perfect example. That working on reports like that, that's a huge job, I can imagine, to put together a report like that. Putting those kinds of things out, I think, is hugely important for policymakers to review, to have that data out there. You know, even for me to be able to see the specific numbers of the decline of newspapers, of reporters, that helps me make my case to the state legislature, right? I'm using that information that's put out there by folks who are far more expert than me to utilize that information to make my case with the state legislature. So I would say plugging into organizations who care about this issue, who are issuing reports, who are organizing letter writing petitions, who are testifying before committees, who are attending rallies, all of those things are really, really important. And there's a lot of work being done out there right now. You know, my role is very, very small one, but, you know, for me to do my small part is heavily dependent upon people writing about it, whether that's on the Seattle Times editorial page or the Columbian or the League putting out reports. All that matters a great deal to then make the case to the policymakers who ultimately will, I think, decide the fate of newspapers in our state and our country moving forward.
Okay, so our many thanks to Washington Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Bob, this is a great, important public policy issue, and we're very grateful for your bringing some light to it for us.